have to felicitate Dr. Anup, Mr. Anup sir from Sri Manpreet Singh Manna ji. We had missed this felicitation. A huge round of applause for Dr. Anup Kumar Rajput, the Professor and Head Department of Elementary Education. The award definitely goes to Stanford Group of Schools. A huge round of applause. I think hands down, one of the most amazing brands that have come up in the preschool segment. A huge round of applause. And there is one last request that I made. Please not go anywhere after we give away the certificates, because we're going to have a group photograph which will be extremely helpful for your branding and marketing, if I say so. So please stay back after you collect the certificate. It'll just take another 15 minutes to get this over with. Next up is, as rightly said in the panel discussion, the first group of preschools that was established. I think Shamrock Group of Schools. A huge round of applause for Shamrock. I have representations from Shamrock to please be on the stage. Amol sir, if you're here. Next up is Bachpan Play School. Hello Kids is next. A huge round of applause for Hello Kids. Next up is Safari Kids. Do we have representation from Safari? Congratulations, ma'am. Next up is Podar Jumbo Kids. A huge round of applause. Congratulations, ma'am. Next up is Maple Bear. उतनी ही तालियां बजनी चाहिए जितनी आपको चाहिए. A huge round of applause for Maple Bear. Next up is Aptech Montana International Preschool. Do we have representations from Aptech? Next up is Vedant International Preschool. Next up is Scottish Early Years. A huge round of applause for Scottish Early Years. Next up is Bright Academy Siliguri. Bright Academy, do we have it here? Next up is Natkhat Play School. So there might be some schools who might not be here, but that does not mean that they don't deserve your claps, okay? They deserve your louder claps because they have been doing a good job and they are not here even to take their certificates. Next up is Birla Open Minds Preschool Mohali. Next up is Genius Kids. Next up is the RD School Noida. Next up is Curious Kids. Next up is OI Play School. Next up is Little Pearls. A huge round of applause for Little Pearls. Next up is Smart Kids Ahmedabad. Smart Kids Ahmedabad. Next up is Canvas International School Delhi. Next up is Birla Open Minds Preschool Hyderabad. Next up is Golden Bells Preschool. इस सर के लिए तो जोर से तालियां हो रही हैं। Congratulations, sir. Next up is Super Kids at Holy Heart.
मैं अपने आपको हम्टी डम्टी बोला था। हम्टी डम्टी सबसे पहली राइम होती है प्ले स्कूल की।
Next up is Super Kids at Holy Hearts. Next up is Star Kids. Right, so we have done with the preschool segment awards. Now we are moving towards the school awards. Okay, before we move ahead, Curious Kids. Curious Kids. now we're starting off with the felicitation of schools. The first one goes to the Delhi Public School, Panipat. A huge round of applause for Delhi Public School, Panipat. So, keeping in mind the timings of the flight, now I would like to say that Dr. Anup Kumar Rajput, who is the professor and head Department of Elementary Education, NCERT, has to leave. So, can we bid him a good farewell by clapping a huge round of applause? Thank you so much for sharing such amazing insights from us, sir. We would love to have you here back once again, sir, if you could.
Thank you very much to all of you. You have long way to go. No doubt journey is difficult. Woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promised you to be miles to go before I sleep and miles to go before I sleep.
Right, so next up is Adi Shankaracharya Convent Public School, Safidong. I hope I am not pronouncing it wrong. Please correct me, audience. Safidong. You know, a Punjabi grown up in Hyderabad is like that. So that's how. Amity International School, Gurugram. Next up is Anand Sagar Academy, Bhatinda. Next up is Ankur School, Chandigarh. Ankur School, Chandigarh. Huge round of applause. I think the discussion that we had earlier regarding the Army Public School, so we have a list of Army Public Schools, one after the other being felicitated. Army Public School, Dakshai. Army Public School, Dakshai. Welcome, sir. A huge round of applause. Next up is Army Public School, Hisar. A huge round of applause. Congratulations, ma'am. Army Public School, Pirpur. Congratulations. Next up is Army Public School, Ambala. Army Public Schools, I think, are leading the way, so huge round of applause for Army Public Schools. Next up is Ashma International School, Mohali. Next up is PDS Public School, Amritsar. Next up is Baba Gandha Singh Memorial Public School, Gurbaxpur. A huge round of applause. Bal Bharti Public School, Dwarka, New Delhi. Bal Bharti Public School, Brij Vihar, Ghaziabad. A huge round of applause. Next up is Bal Bharti Public School, Sector 14, Rohini, New Delhi. Next up is Banyan Tree School, Chandigarh. A huge round of applause. Congratulations, ma'am. Next up is Bawal Alwani Public School, Kapurthala. Next up is PCM Arya Model Senior Secondary School, Ludhiana. PCM Arya Model Senior Secondary School, Ludhiana. Next up is DCM School, Ludhiana. And DCM School, Chandigarh Road, Ludhiana. Next up is Bhavan Vidyalaya, Panchkula. Next up is Blossoms Convent School, Ludhiana. Next up is Bright Scholar Senior Secondary School, Sonipat. Next up is Shamrock Group of Schools. A huge round of applause. Congratulations, sir, and thank you for being an inspiration to the complete industry. A huge round of applause for Mr. Amol Arora. Next up is CD International School, Gurugram. Next up is Cambridge Global School, Patiala. Next up is Cambridge Global School, Bhatinda. Next up is Cambridge International School, Kapurthala. In fact, the Cambridge group has been doing so good. We have close to 5 schools nominated. A huge round of applause for Cambridge International Schools. Next up is Cambridge International School, Dasua. Next up is Blossoms Convent School, Ludhiana. Next up is Cambridge International School, Patti. Next up is Cambridge International School, Phagwara. Next up is Cambridge International School, Kariya Nawashahar. Next up is Chitkara International School, Chandigarh. Next up is DCM Group of Schools, Ludhiana. We have DCM Group of Schools. Next up is DC Model International School, Firozpur City. Next up is Derek International School, Banga. Hermes International Public School, Bhatinda. Next up is Hermes Nursery School, Bukeria. I'm sorry if I pronounce wrongly, you can please correct me. Dasmesh Nursery School, Mukera. Is that Mukera? Mukeria. Next up is DAV International School, Verka Chowk, Amritsar. Next up is DAV Senior Secondary Public School, Panchkula. These schools might not be here, but they definitely deserve a round of applause. Next up is Delhi Public School, Panipat. Delhi Public School, Kurukshetra. Next up is Delhi Public School, Sonipat. Next up is Delhi Public School, Vasant Kunj, New Delhi. Next up is Doaba Public Senior Secondary School, Parol. Next up is Doon Public School, Panchkula. Next up is Dr. Devraj DAV Senior Secondary Public School, Sangrur. Next up is DRV DAV Centenary Public School, Jalandhar. Next up is DSA International School, Chandigarh. Next up is Ekalavya School, Jalandhar. Next up is GD Goenka Public School, New Delhi. Next up is GAD World School, Bhatinda. Next up is James Cambridge International School, Hoshiarpur. Next up is GHG Academy, Ludhiana. Next up is Global Public School, Gohana. We have Global Public School with us, Global Public School, Panchkula. Global Public School, Panchkula with us. Next up is Guru Gobind Singh Public School, Hoshiarpur. Congratulations, ma'am. Guru Gobind Singh Public School, Hoshiarpur. Next up is Guru Tej Bahadur Public School, Chandigarh. Guru Tej Bahadur Public School, Chandigarh. Next up is Gurukul Senior Secondary School, Sonipat. Next up is Hallmark Public School, Panchkula. Next up is Hansraj Public School, Panchkula. Really apologize for this hurry. As you can hear the noise. We are supposed to release the venue as soon as possible, so that's why all the haywire. It's a sincere apology from my end. It is my responsibility, being the host of the show, to conduct it in a smooth fashion, and I really apologize for the same. Next up is Hansraj Public School, Panchkula. Next up is Harkishan Memorial Public School, Rohtak. Next up is Heritage Global School, Faridabad. Next up is Hem Academy Public School, Hamirpur.
Not individual.
Next up is Holy Hearts Junior, Amritsar. Next up is Holy Heart Presidency School, Amritsar. Holy Heart, Amritsar. I-Word International School, Hisar. Next up is Indian Public School, Hisar. Indus Global School, Mandi. Indus Public School, Hisar. Indus Valley Public School, Noida. Indus Public School, Hisar, a huge round of applause. Next up is Indus Valley Public School, Noida. Next up is Innocent Heart School, Jalandhar. Innocent Heart School, Jalandhar. Next up is Ishwar International School, Gohana. Next up is Jagat Jyoti Model High School, Amritsar. A huge round of applause for Jagat Jyoti Model High School, Amritsar. Next up is Kasiga School, Purpul. Next up is Kirpal Sagar Academy, Nawa Shahar, Jalandhar. LA Blossom School, Usmanpur. Lancers International School, Gurugram. Lovely Public Senior Secondary School, Delhi. Next up is MD Minda Memorial School, Hisar. MD Minda. Maharaja Agrasen Public School, Narela. Next up is Mahavir International School, Gurdaspur. Next up is Mahavir Public Senior Secondary School, Sundarnagar. Next up is Manav Rashna International School, Faridabad. A huge round of applause for Mahavir Public Senior Secondary School, Sundarnagar. Next up is Manav Rashna International School, Faridabad. Next up is Manav Rashna International School, Sector 51, Gurugram. Next up is Manav Sayog School, Jalandhar. Next up is Mata Jaswant Kaur Memorial Public School, Badal. Mata Jaswant Kaur Memorial Public School, Badal. Next up is My Tree School, Kharar, Mohali. Kharar. My Tree School, Kharar, Mohali. Next up is Modern Public School, Delhi. Next up is Modern Secular Public School, Bikhi. Next up is Modern Age Model School, Chandigarh. Next up is Monal Himalayan Public School, Manali. Next up is Montessori Cameron School, Pathankot. Next up is Mount Olympus School, Gurugram. Mount Olympus School, Gurugram. Next up is Mussoorie International School, Mussoorie. Next up is NK Bagrodia Public School, Sector 4, Dwarka, New Delhi. Next up is Nankana Sahib Public School, Gill Park, Ludhiana. Next up is Om Prakash Bansal Modern School, Fatehgarh Sahib. PKR Jain Vatika Senior Secondary School, Ambala City. Do we have PKR? I think I should start taking out the roll call attendance. Congratulations, ma'am. Next up is Pan World School, Chandigarh. Next up is Pandit Mohan Lal Sanatan Dharm School, Chandigarh. Next up is Pragyan Public School, Noida. Next up is Punjab Public School, Nabha. Next up is Punjab Public School, Muktasar. RK Global School, Delhi. Next up is RK Global School, Delhi. Next up is RK Memorial Senior Secondary School, Sonipat. Next up is Rainbow Academy Senior Secondary School, Haldwani. Next up is Rajkul Senior Secondary School, Karnal. Next up is Ramjo School, New Delhi. Congratulations, ma'am. Next up is Rao Prahlad Senior Secondary School, Mahendragarh. applause. Rayat International School, Mohali. RPS Public School, Rewari. Next up is Rukmini Devi, Jaipuria Public School, New Delhi. RD Jaipuria. Next up is SA Jain Senior Secondary School, Ambala. Next up is Saffron Public School, Kapurthala. Next up is Saini Public School, Kurukshetra. Next up is Saint MSG Glorious International School, Sirsa. Next up is Salwan Public School, Rajendra Nagar, New Delhi. So we have Salwan Public School, Rajendra Nagar, New Delhi. Next up is Sarvottam International School, Noida Extension. Next up is Scottish High International School, Gurgaon. Seva International Public School, Sangrur. I think it's Saiba if I'm not wrong, or Seva. SEAVA International Public School, Sangrur. Next up is Sri PSM Public School, Dhahlan, Himachal Pradesh. Next up is Siddharth International School, Hisar. Next up is Solitaire International School, Panchkula. Next up is Sri Venkateshwar International School, Sector 18, New Delhi. Next up is Saint Kabir Gurukul School, Jalalabad. Next up is St. Paul's High School, Ambala. Next up is St. Soldier's School, Panchkula. Next up is Saint Vivekananda Millennium School, Panchkula. Next up is St. John's High School, Chandigarh. St. John's High School. Next up is St. Paul's International School, Mohali. Next up is Tagore International School, east of Kailash, Delhi. Do we have Tagore International? Congratulations, ma'am. One of the most renowned schools in east of Kailash, I think. Tagore International should get a lot of round of applause. Next up is Takshila School, Barnala. Congratulations, sir. The British School, Panchkula. A huge round of applause for the British School. Next up is the Millennium School, Patiala. The Millennium School, Patiala. Next up is the Olive School, Fatehabad. The Scholar School, New Delhi. Scholar School, New Delhi. Next up is Vision India School, Bageshwari. Next up is Wonder Kids Playway School, Karnal. Wonder Kids Playway School, Karnal. Next up is Woodland Overseas School, Hoshiarpur. Next up is Yadavendra Public School, Mohali. Next up is Yadavendra Public School, Patiala. Next up is Sri Guru Harkishan Model School, Chandigarh. Sri Guru Harkishan Women Model School, Chandigarh. Next up is Satluj Public School, Panchkula. Next up is Satluj Senior School, International, Panchkula. Next up is Manav Rasna International School, Sector 46, Faridabad. Next up is Maxim Mary School. Maxim Mary School. Next up is St. Warrior School. St. Warrior School, a huge round of applause. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful and patient audience. This has been a wonderful summit to conclude.